You're listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, go to nakedbiblepodcast.com and click on the support link in the upper right-hand corner. If you're new to the podcast and Dr. Heiser's approach to the Bible, click on New Start Here at nakedbiblepodcast.com.
Welcome to the Naked Bible Podcast, episode 128, Conference Interviews, Part 1. I'm the layman, Trey Strickland, and he's the scholar, Dr. Michael Heiser. Hey, Mike, we're here live at ETS. What do you know?
Another year, Evangelical Theological Society annual meeting. Last year, we did something a little bit primitive where I walked around and tried to capture people and say, hey, why are you here? Why did you come to this thing? And what are you doing? This year, we're going to make a real effort to get a little more substantive in our interviews. In this first one, we're going to be talking to Carl Sanders and Thomas Hudgens. Now, both of these gentlemen teach at Capital Seminary, or Thomas teaches at Capital. Carl used to teach at Capital, but he's now affiliated with Lancaster Seminary. They sort of merged. So both of them are colleagues together. And then we'll also be talking to Randall Price. Randall is an adjunct online like I am with Liberty University, but he also spends some Green Campus time at Liberty teaching occasionally. But he's more known for his own personal ministry, World of the Bible. So Carl Sanders, Thomas Hudgens, and Randall Price on this episode. Well, we're here at ETS, and we have two guests for this segment of the podcast interviews. And one is Carl Sanders, and our second guest is Thomas Hudgens. Did I say the last name correctly?
Yes, you did.
Okay, well, Carl, we'll start with you. Carl
Okay.
and I have a long history together, but just introduce yourself briefly, and then we'll have Thomas do the same.
Okay. I'm a professor of theology primarily at Capital Seminary and Graduate School, just outside of D.C. And like I said, Mike and I have known each other for decades, I think, and so it's great to be here.
Long.
It is that long. It's amazing. We've had some interesting experiences along the way.
Yeah, Thomas.
My name is Thomas Hudgens, and teach at Capital Seminary and Graduate School in the environs of D.C., and teach New Testament and Greek, and just enjoy spending lots of quality time with Carl Sanders, whose office is right beside mine.
Oh, my. Well, that explains a whole lot here. Yes. Well, I wanted to talk to you guys about language, biblical language learning. We'll just keep it simple that way. And this was in part driven by an email I got from Carl, who said now you just gave the paper, right? But
yesterday afternoon.
Thomas was sort of your partner in crime.
I think we could say that.
Okay,
safely,
well,
yes.
This has turned out to be a really controversial paper. So, Carl, why don't you give people the gist of the paper, and that'll get us into the topic.
Okay. Basically, the paper dealt with pedagogy for teaching biblical languages. And part of what drove this was some stuff that's happened at our school in terms of having to change our curriculum, having to redesign things. And we had to do some really non-traditional things. And in the midst of doing that and reading and trying to support and explain what we were doing, we ran into a lot of material from second language acquisition research. There are a lot of languages out there, and people study how people actually learn languages. And the surprising thing I think we discovered, the surprising thing was it seemed like almost no one, maybe no one. I'm Minnesota nice here. Almost no one.
Trying not to pretend you're omniscient. Right?
But almost no one who teaches biblical languages apparently is reading widely in this literature. I mean, so how people learn French and German and Spanish, there's a bunch of stuff out there, and it's not being applied in how we teach Greek and Hebrew. And as Thomas likes to say, language is language. Learning a language is learning a language. It's not, as I say in the paper, it's not a Heilige Geist language, nor a Heilige Geist pedagogy, a Holy Ghost language or a Holy Ghost pedagogy. It should be the same. It should work the same. And so the paper basically does a couple things. It talks first a little bit about how technology is changing education in general, and how kind of hybrid education where we're using technology plus human judgment to do things better. There's an analogy that comes from a work by Tyler Cowen, who's a labor economist. He used a new mode of playing chess called freestyle chess, where players play chess as teams with computer programs, multiple programs, and so on. And the best teams are the ones that have multiple players and multiple computer programs. It's not one or the other. It's kind of hybrid. And he says this is how things are increasingly going. So first point was we need to think about what education should be like in this new age. And then the second part was just in the second language acquisition research, the dominant mode of teaching languages in seminaries is what's called grammar translation. You learn the rules of grammar. This is a verb. These are the different kinds of verbs. This is the forms. You learn in Greek, you learn the verb forms. Luo, lues, lue, luamen, lueti, luusi.
Memorize the paradigm.
You memorize all the paradigms, and then you translate really easy sentences because you can't do hard stuff. So you translate, Paul threw the ball or something like that. And then we say, now you're prepared to work in the Greek or the Hebrew. And
now you're prepared for ministry.
That's right. But the grammar translation method in general for linguists who study this say it doesn't work. It's ineffective, or as one textbook says, it's a practice with no theory, no explanation.
That would be the controversial part. Again, for listeners, again, if you've had biblical languages, you already know exactly what we're talking about. If you haven't, this is the way, what Carl just described, this is the way that traditional language courses go. Piles of memorizing grammatical forms and vocabulary, and then you're supposed to sort of put that together. And you're right, you can only do that if things sort of follow an easy pattern. And you never really get to, okay, well, now I can take that simple sentence and put it into English, or I can take this verse, typically out of John, because that's pretty easy Greek, put that into English. And I never really asked the question, why am I doing this? Because we already have English translations. So what value is there in it? In other words, when do I get to understanding or seeing, apprehending what Greek will reveal to me interpretively? In other words, that's the question I want to answer, because that's really why I took the class. I didn't take the class to produce yet another English translation. When do we get to the value, the interpretive value of what we're doing? So since that's not the norm, and you're basically criticizing the norm.
You could say that pretty harshly. There were some gut punches there.
So when do we get to the payoff? So which one of you wants to answer that particular question?
So I'm going to be, Carl is Minnesota nice, and I'll probably be a little more rogue in my answer. But Mike, if I could just tell you and your audience what most of my Greek and Hebrew classes were like. And I say most. There was only really one professor that did anything slightly different in my life that made those courses of significant value. But just imagine going to a class and you spend 10 or 15 minutes where there's usually a golden nugget devotional using the Greek New Testament. You spend about 10 or 15 minutes taking a quiz, then you end up grading the quiz. Then the professor just kind of flips through 3 or 4 pages of whatever the grammar is that they're going to cover that week, kind of makes some observations. Hey, make sure you pay attention to this paragraph. You need to make sure you memorize this paradigm. And then for the next hour and a half to 2 hours, that professor will look around at the class and say, hey, John, do me a favor. What'd you get for translation exercise number 1? And that student, if he's done an effective job at translating, will share with everybody his absolute most intentionally ambiguous translation, where, every genitive is translated with of, like of Thomas. This is the love of Thomas. Everything is of Thomas if it's a genitive, things like that. And then after he recites this very simple, absolutely ambiguous translation, the professor will look around at the whole class and go, interesting. So anybody have anything different than that? And of course, nobody can have anything different because they're only taught to do intentionally ambiguous translations. And that goes on for about 2 hours. So that's really biblical language pedagogy at most seminaries summed up in a nutshell. And unfortunately, when we figure out how much students are actually paying for biblical language courses, it turns into really an ethical issue. And Carl and I have talked about that before. I mean, can we really justify taking as much money from students as we do for something that has almost zero immediate transfer into local church ministry? That's a major question. I don't think most people want to ask that question, Mike. I think it's a scary question to ask. Every single course, all learning is the same. Every single course in our seminole curriculum, in our Bible college curriculum, et cetera, all learning needs to have immediate transfer into local church ministry and into the ministries in which our students are serving. Unfortunately, Greek and Hebrew get a pass, and they don't have any immediate transfer. After all, nobody that I've taught is going out to an unreached people group and carrying over the New Testament into a language in which it hasn't been carried into. Now, translation programs are important, but by and large, every single student I've had is going to be going into a local church where, Sunday they're teaching, Monday, pastors take off on Monday, they got to relax a little bit. And then Tuesday comes around, they've got maybe like 5 or 6 hours to, study their Bibles. And that may even get interrupted because somebody's marriage is falling apart and they come and knock on the door. And then maybe they can squeeze in a couple of hours later. And then they've got to go to a hospital visit, all of this stuff. There's no time, nor is there a need for someone to sit down and start from scratch and wrestle with the Greek text in a way that ultimately produces something that is more unintelligible than, I don't know, the New American Standard Bible 1977 edition.
I mean, the struggles here, this isn't going to be new to my audience because we've talked a little bit about, learning Hebrew and Greek during the course of the podcast. I will use, a little bit, you drill down somewhere in the text, you talk about a word and do a little bit of word study, or you talk about a point of grammar. And people need to realize that when you're in first year Greek or Hebrew, that is not what you're doing. Okay, you never really get to interpretive payoff. Like you said, the little golden nugget devotional, yeah, that can happen periodically, but nobody's sort of coming alongside the student and saying, well, congratulations, Johnny, you've just, given me the, aorist active indicative paradigm, congratulations. But here's where it really matters. Here's an instance where it really matters to know this form as opposed to that form. Or if you have a middle passive, here's where it matters, where you would come down, interpret it. Nobody does that. So the kind of things that you hear, again, periodically in the podcast, you hear me doing, it's going to sound really bizarre, but you actually don't get to do that in most of your seminary language courses. It is rote memory. It is, again, when you really kind of get on the other side of it and you look back and you wonder, is there a way I can look at that and not call it pointless? Because, again, I already had my own translations. Why did I need to produce something else? When do I see the payoff? So our listeners are going to be familiar with what Johnny and I did at Logos as colleagues. In fact, we just recently interviewed Johnny. Johnny's no longer at Logos or Faith Life, and he's struck out on his own, and he's created a word study course that's, it's 2 or 3 hours. It's, 15 videos or whatever. Real quick, it gets you to the things that you need to know with specific examples and video. Here's why you would care, but really condensing it and giving people a chance that they don't have to buy software. They don't have to spend hundreds or thousands of dollars in software. It's not going to take you the equivalent of a semester or 6 months to go through the program. Here's just something you can use once you graduate from Bible reading. You might have heard of Strong's numbers, but the limitations of that. Here's some other things you can do with free resources. But it's about method and it's about payoff. So that's a little snippet of what could be happening, should be happening right from the first day in terms of courses, but it's not. So what I want to ask either of you now, okay, with that sort of as a backdrop, and again, I've been kind of in trouble for this for a long time, and so has Johnny, because we've been very public about criticizing the way languages are taught, both inside the building when professors come. I mean, it got to the point where I had to ask to not be invited to to meetings because I didn't want to just go off and then hurt the company in some way by criticizing what people were doing in class. So we've been down that road, and online, I've again gotten into trouble here and there about this. But now you guys, to do this at this conference, it's one of those. I wish I'd have been a fly on the wall, for that one. I do have the paper. I haven't read it yet, but I guess I could ask you: do you guys mind if I post the paper online, or are you going to submit it somewhere? Okay, then we won't do that. We'll wait till you submit it, and then we can hopefully get access to it in some other way. But just tell me now, what I want to know things like what was the reaction in the room? What do you think should be happening? And again, what's the pushback to that?
Well, I think first to say there's an awful lot of skepticism. And it's an interesting kind of skepticism. One of the points the paper makes is no one is assessing the current models seriously. The last real attempt to understand how effective these classes are for after seminary, what pastors are actually doing it with these languages, is 50 years old. So one of the problems is we're dealing with a black hole information-wise. So I think everyone, or at least an awful lot of people, intuitively know. And Mike, I think in one of his posts a while back, said maybe 10% of people are using the languages effectively. Whatever percentage, if it's 10% or 20% or even 30%, there's a lot of people who aren't.
10% is optimistic.
But whatever the number is. So on one end, people just say, well, I had this student call me last week and ask me some question about Greek. See, that proves everyone is using it. So, the logic there fails me a little bit. But so part of it is just resistance. We're really doing better than you say we are, because I'm being pretty critical, saying this really doesn't work, and there's no reason to think it should work based on anything linguistics or anything else. So that's part of the pushback. The second part of the pushback we hear regularly is, what about those people who want to be professors, want to be in a PhD program? And the problem is that's not what seminary training is supposed to be for.
What about our favorite students?
Yeah, what about those guys who hang around with me and want me to tell them all my golden nuggets, and they just want to bask in the glow of my wisdom and knowledge, So there's a lot of temptation for seminary professors overall, particularly I'm thinking of seminaries, to want to produce professors rather than pastors. And seminaries have a mission of preparing pastors. That's the MDiv, which is the primary degree, really is focused on pastoral preparation. So people are concerned, well, what about the one or two students in my class that might want to go into PhD work? Will they be disadvantaged by this? And it just seems to me we've flipped things around. We're letting the tail wag the dog there. And then there are just other things. Well, you don't have any evidence. Well, there's a sense in which this is true. This is a kind of an experimental approach, what we're doing, where in just a 12-week total course, people are learning the whole exegetical method. They're doing text criticism. They're doing word studies. They're doing syntactical issues. They're thinking about biblical and theological issues related to that passage and constructing actually a teaching or preaching outline from it. They're doing all of that in 12 weeks, which is... It's just turning things up on its head. Again, it's very much about the tasks that they're actually going to do in ministry.
Tell them about your title, the title of the paper.
The title was just Learning Biblical Languages by the Book, Rethinking the Status Questionis, the Status Quo. And the point is, the Greek grammars, since the first one published in the United States about 240 years ago, have almost always been exactly the same. They start with forms and paradigms, and they occasionally do nouns first or verbs first.
Or even more complicated is when they throw in the tracks, like turn to page 93 if you want John to go to the movies, or if you want John to go to the store, turn back to 104.
That's the choose your own adventure grammar, I guess. But anyway, so it's been that way, and so we've allowed these books, which are built on grammatical features, that's they're structured by, we allow that to dictate our pedagogy. And there's no reason in any of the literature on second language acquisition to suggest students actually learn languages that way. In fact, all the evidence says they don't. So we've got and let's face it, textbook authors and textbook publishers don't like to hear this because it really is an indictment of what's being produced there. And this is true by the way, this is true not just for biblical languages. It's for people who publish German textbooks and Spanish textbooks. They want one textbook that we can use everywhere. And that's just not how language learning really works. So there's a problem there. So I just think it's interesting. There's a lot of pushback, and people will say things like, yeah, we need to make it more practical, or I'm with you partway, but we're still going to do this ineffective model. And so we've been struggling with that in a number of places, but the revolution is coming.
Did you propose a particular sort of tools-based model? And you mentioned this 12-week course. Did the paper, any part of it, sort of try to build up that approach generally, or did you just sort of give them both barrels and then take Q&A?
A lot of both barrels. There's a section in the paper where I actually talk about the course, and actually it's more Thomas's course, so maybe he'd be the right person to talk about this, but I'll just say I kind of sketched out what this looks like. It covers a lot of the same material, absent memorizing paradigms, absent the translations. You're doing all the same skills. The problem is right now where we wait till the third or fourth semester to do those skills, we're doing them right away.
Which fewer and fewer are taking.
Yeah, and one of the problems is people are taking fewer language courses. So if you wait till the third or fourth semester, people aren't benefiting from them. So we're pushing all those things near the front end, and that's the plus side. We're heavily dependent on tools to make that happen, because you don't unless you do the traditional model, it's going to be hard to know what the whether this is a future tense or an aorist tense verb, for example, in the Greek. So we use the tools to help facilitate moving students to that payoff very quickly. But it's not just driven by tools, it's driven by this thought of what are the things pastors actually need to do with the language? What are the tasks they need to do?
Your average Bible student is going to have that question too. Again, anyone who graduates from Bible reading, they discover that Bible reading isn't Bible study. And so they want to move beyond reading. And again, when I was a teenager, and the first book I ever bought other than the Bible was a Strong's Concordance, because that was what somebody told me to do. And, you get some use out of that, but you start to develop, again, the intuition that there's a lot more to this than just being able to read. And if you really think about it, if the goal of your language classes is to produce a translation, that just gives me something else to read. In other words, it doesn't really take you anywhere beyond that. So, getting into, for again, the person who doesn't either have the time, doesn't want to spend the money to take a full-blown either semester or year-long sequence in either Greek or Hebrew, this is the kind of thing that I think listeners can grasp pretty quickly. This is the kind of approach that they could use right out of the box, so to speak, right out of the gate. That there's a method I can learn here. There's a tool I can use to get me, again, beyond English, that doesn't require me to reproduce English, again, their own translation, and can get some interpretive value out of it. So Thomas, what do you do in your classes, or again, what would you recommend?
So we want to leverage every single second that we have with the students, and that means even repeating stuff that doesn't necessarily fall under a traditional Greek course. So, for example, in the first week, every single Greek course, every single language course in the world, the first thing you're going to do is you're going to learn what? The alphabet. So it's kind of hard for students to go much further in the language in the first week than learning the alphabet. But it's not really that hard to learn the alphabet. So we don't really want to waste our time with the students. So what we do is we actually have them doing a historical analysis the same week. In particular, we have Logos Bible software. All of our students have it. But you could do that with any number of tools, but reinforcing something that they would have had in a previous course, in a hermeneutics course or a biblical narrative course, and getting them to sort of prime the pump on we're moving towards exegesis. Not the focus is not the alphabet. The focus is exegesis. So And another thing, and this is kind of odd, but I've actually never been I've never been in a Greek course where in the first week someone had to actually read from their Greek New Testament. It's pretty interesting that people can actually read from their Greek New Testament without actually being able to pronounce the words. When I first began learning Spanish, it was amazing how I could, read a newspaper and not even understand what I was reading. But if you know what the letters sound like, you can actually do it. What actually is a better way to measure whether or not someone's learned the alphabet? Well, how about just try and read it, and then you can see it. If you're actually just writing letters down on a piece of paper, that doesn't tell me if you know what sounds they make. It doesn't tell me if you know the difference between a short O sound or a long O sound. And the reason why I mentioned that, Mike, is because one of the criticisms that Carl didn't mention is that sometimes people actually think that that with the model that we have, we're actually giving them less of the grammar. I would actually say, what's harder in the first week? Writing the alphabet down, regurgitating it on a piece of paper, or having to record yourself reading Mark 1 through 3 in Greek with all of its with all of the letters and diphthongs and all of the things that you find there, and then submitting that to your professor and having him listen to it and see whether or not you can do it without any helps, notes, or anything like that. Much harder. By week 2, we start looking at verbs, and students, instead of memorizing all of the forms for a bunch of verbs in the present active indicative or the future active indicative, we just want them to understand that there's nothing before the stem. There's nothing before the stem, and the only thing that's different between a present and a future is the sigma. And immediately you can start showing them how to identify a future or a present. What's interesting is that one, it's kind of like how the Noahic covenant, when you're doing the biblical covenants, how the Noahic covenant sort of sets the framework for how you understand all of the other biblical covenants. When you start with the present and the future active indicative, and you understand that you have a stem and then you have a primary active suffix, and the only thing that makes it different is this little sigma that goes in between those two that turns it into a future. That kind of paves the way for understanding all of the other tenses, and you let the parts of the language communicate different things about the grammar. The reason why I mention that, though, Mike, is because I want people to understand that we're not teaching a tool or a group of tools, and we're not. This isn't just an exegesis course kind of on steroids. You're still getting the grammar. My students are still memorizing 100 words of Greek per week. But in addition to all of that, the focus, more than the grammar, the focus is on exegesis. So week 3, they're doing a word study. They're reading Don Carson's chapter in exegetical fallacies on word study fallacies. They're seeing the one thing that pastors seem to never read for some reason is Don Carson's exegetical fallacies, and that's why you get people still talking about dynamite in local churches when they see dunamis, and the church is still somehow means the called out ones and things. These word study fallacies are all through local churches. Well, we want them to actually understand what those fallacies are in our classes, and we want them to see the types of tools that they can use to be able to do proper word studies.
So, like, if I were one of your students, what I might expect is, okay, here we are in week 3. We're learning, some sort of grammatical concept or element. But instead of being asked, my homework would not be go translate this or that. No. My homework would be something like, okay, here's a form in this verse. You know what it is and you know what it isn't. Why do you think the writer picked this form? In other words, you have to learn to ask good interpretive questions. Yeah. Of what you're able to identify. So in week 3, for example, a basic thing is, how do you figure out which word warrants a word study? Helping a student with something as basic as that. Here, take this discourse unit. Identify the 2 words in this passage that you need to do a word study on, that you need to dig a little further into the resources to figure out what does this word actually mean. One that comes up is like 2 Corinthians 5:21, which is like a verse that ought to make sense to everybody. If you shared that verse with somebody at the 7-Eleven, it should make sense because it's actually the gospel that people get saved by. But for some reason, our translations, it's intentionally ambiguous. It says, what is it? He made him who knew no sin to become sin on our behalf, so that those of us who believe in him might become the righteousness of God in him. Nobody knows what that means, but somehow that's the message that was given
to the ministers of reconciliation by which people could be saved. So I want our students to be able to go to that passage and say, all right, which words? I don't need to look at the word "the." I don't need to look at the word "and." I don't need to look at, which ones jump out. And I want them to identify what are the words that are worth doing a lexical study. They'll do that by the second day of the week. By the fourth day of the week, we're actually going to dig into the actual resources that they can help them get the information they need in order to think through the use of the meaning of a particular word in a particular context. But week 3, word studies. By week 4, we've transitioned from lexical issues to syntactical issues. And one of the things that came up, and this is how we know that our courses are a work in progress, and this is one example of how even we're changing the model that we're doing. But it becomes really. I was asking students to do a syntactical study, identify a syntactical issue, and then flesh out the options using the resources they have, like some exegetical commentaries and things like that. And what I found is everybody defaults to word studies. They just want to do word studies. So I came up with a way. I walked them through in a video 2 different commentaries where I walk through and I go, as we're reading it, I go, this is a lexical issue. How do you know? Well, it says this word means. Well, when you see this word means, it's a lexical issue 99% of the time. Or look in the parentheses how they're supporting the evidence for their interpretation. They have BDAG. When you see BDAG, that's a lexicon. That means it's a lexical issue. And then when we get to like Romans 5:8, and it goes, but God demonstrates his own love toward us, and that while we were yet sinners, Christ died for us. And you find somebody talking about the huper hemon, for us, in that passage, and they're talking about how do we understand that? Is that a substitution? Is that substitution language, or is that for our benefit? That's a syntactical issue, because we're not talking about the meaning of a word. We're talking about how these words work together. And then I explain it, bridging it over into English, because most people don't think this way even in their own language, because we just learn to talk this way. But I explain, I could tell you I got to go to the store to get a present for my wife. And I explained this to them. Well, what do I mean by for my wife? Well, I could mean 2 things. I could mean I'm going to go get one because I'm going to give it to her, or I'm going to go get one because Leslie told me she's busy right now and she can't go, so I'm going to go in her place. But we're expanding this exegesis to focus on incorporating different tools that they would never use. Nothing against Blue Letter Bible or anything like that, but nothing against any of these different resources. But we want to start getting people into resources that they otherwise, if they weren't in a class like this, would never use.
Yeah, that's good, because I've often said on the podcast, again, we had Johnny a little while back, that really the battle, either when it comes to a word study or a syntactical issue, some grammatical form, a lot of, when you hear the word exegesis, you should be thinking the skill of asking good questions about what you're reading. Okay, just becoming a very close reader and learning to ask really, really good interpretive questions. If you can do that, you're going to be just miles down the road in your biblical understanding, because you can go buy a bunch of tools. Okay, you can go buy a bunch of books that'll lexicons, grammars, whatever. But if you can't ask a good question about that thing you're looking at, that thing your software has located for you, and that's what software is good for. It concords, the instantaneous speed. You can do all of that, but if you can't think well, then it really doesn't get you very far. So again, I realize some listeners might be thinking, oh, come on. Surely if I go to seminary and I take a language class, they're going to teach me how to think carefully and think well. Well, they might if you stick around for 3 or 4 years, but they will not if you're in a first-year course. That is the elephant in the room. That's the dirty little truth. That is just what happens, and it happens that way not because professors are nasty. It just happens that way because they are imitating a model that they sat under, and they were the doctoral student. They were the one that just couldn't get enough of this, and they went on and they did graduate work, so on and so forth.
I just had a conversation the other day with a younger guy who's here at the conference. He's presenting a paper. We were chatting, and he said, I taught Greek in the past. So, you might like my paper, you might not. Being quite aware of the response. And I described briefly what it was. I said, we don't really do paradigms. And he said to me, I loved the paradigms. They were great. I just loved them. They helped me learn the language so much. And in my head, I said, I probably could have said it out loud. I don't think I did. My thought in my head was, you are weird. Now, and I want to make it clear. I'm at ETS. A large percentage of the people here are weird. In the sense we're academics. We have a different way of thinking. We have different values. We have different things we focus on. And it's really hard for us to separate our preferences from what is beneficial to our students. And so, when you're weird and unusual and you have this focus, you have to say, it's not what I like. What's really good for the student? What benefits them? So,
yeah, I used to say that all the time in the building and even to students and, online as well. I was a language geek. Okay, I loved it. I mean, I love the memorization. I like the solving the puzzle. All this sort of thing. Okay, I was weird, but I'm unrepentant. Okay, I'm good with that. But when we created the learn to use thing, and we'd have professors and we would try to explain this product to them. And now, like with Johnny's word study course, that we're trying to get people into, we would try to explain it that way. Look, all of us in the room here, we're the language geeks. Okay, we loved it, but we have to realize we have to come to grips with the fact that most people were not like us, and it's just not right for them to be disserved because we were among the 2 or 3 people in that class that the professor sort of gravitated to because we were one of them. We were like him, or her, that this was just our thing. And it's very easy as an instructor to just, you look for those students. Those are the ones that you're going to pay special attention to. And I hate to put, they're not going to consciously care less about the other ones, but there's going to be this fondness, this affinity, right, like attracts like. And that's just the way it works. So what we would try to convince people of is, look, let's just change the model. Let's take the exegesis, the stuff that you'd only get in the 3rd or 4th year, put that in the first year, front load it so everyone is served well, and then the people who are just like you, they're going to come out of the woodwork anyway. You're going to know who those people are, and then you move them into a more traditional track because they love the memorization. They're just like you, and but if you do it, if you front load the other part, everybody gets served. Everybody gets skills. They know why they're doing this. They're not going to feel like failures because they couldn't memorize all this stuff, or even if they got A's in the class. At the end of that class, and it might be the only language class that's required, because most seminaries now only, if they even require any language courses, it's 1 year. They get to the end of that year and you ask them, what did they learn? I learned how to translate. I can produce an English translation. Well, hey, right over there's a shelf of 200 of them. And if you put it in those terms, it's very normal to say, well, what did I even do that for? Well, I want to thank both of you guys for taking time to talk about Carl's explosive paper. And if I hear your name uttered in vain under someone's breath this week, I will give you a heads up. So you can be looking behind you. But no, this is something that's really valuable. People need to realize that you can get benefit from biblical languages without having to spend thousands of dollars going to class, doing the degree thing. You just have to know where to find, again, the strategies. Who can I go to? Where can I go? What are some things I can get to teach me how to think well about the biblical text? And then that's your next step, and then you move on from there. So it's not rocket science. We don't do rocket science here at the Biblical Studies Conference. But you'd think, again, you'd think a lot of people just can't, for some reason, think beyond the old model, and it's frustrating. But I want to spend a little more time with Thomas, so if you have a few minutes, just stick around and you do something else that's interesting to the audience. Okay, Thomas, tell the listeners a little bit more about what you do academically, sort of at a different level, different area of New Testament studies. And I should tell people, if you either you want to break now and go listen to a little bit of it, or after we're done here with Thomas, we did an episode on New Testament manuscripts and some of the myths behind them. Well, Thomas has his head in that world very deeply. So why don't you just tell the listeners what else you're into?
Well, this is very, very exciting. Most people don't want to know what you write your books on, but here we go. Just imagine back at the beginning of the 16th century. Right now, we're celebrating the Reformation, and one of the important figures for that is a man named Erasmus. And we really appreciate Erasmus. He successfully put together the first Greek New Testament that was printed and published first. What most people don't know is that 2 years before Erasmus's Greek New Testament was published, there was another Greek New Testament that was printed, and it was printed over in Spain in a place called Alcalá de Henares, just right outside of Madrid in this beautiful little town, by Cisneros, a Catholic cardinal, and a team of Spanish philologists. It is the most beautiful Greek New Testament. It really puts Erasmus's Greek New Testament to shame as far as its presentation and its aesthetics. What's interesting, Mike, is everybody talks about this first printed Greek New Testament, but it's always as like an introduction to talking about Erasmus and his Greek New Testament. And so it's unfortunate that this really beautiful and, in my opinion, more important Greek New Testament just sort of gets lost in the fog, and is sort of only viewed in the shadow of Erasmus's. When in actuality, I think it's Erasmus's that ought to be viewed in the shadow of the Complutensian polyglot Bible and the Complutensian Greek New Testament. The reason why we wanted to study this is everybody basically writes the same thing in all of the books and all of the introductions talking about the Greek New Testament and the history of the Greek New Testament. The one thing that everybody always points out about the first printed Greek New Testament that was printed in Spain is that supposedly, and I put supposedly, you can't see me making quotation marks right now, but I am, supposedly the manuscripts that they used for that Greek New Testament came from the Vatican. Nobody had ever really done a comprehensive assessment of whether or not manuscripts actually did come from the Vatican. So in order to do that, you have to take the Vatican manuscripts and look at what their Greek manuscripts say, and there are differences in Greek manuscripts. And then we have to compare that to the text that the Complutensian editors put together. And Mike, I will tell you, it looks incredible how much divergence there is between the Complutensian text and those manuscripts that are at the Vatican. There's a lot.
So tell the listeners, give them a quick definition of what the Complutensian polyglot is. Okay, the term polyglot is going to throw some people. And then I think listeners can pick up on the fact that when you did your work on the polyglot, you actually had to gain access to the secret archives. Oh, yeah, like Tom Hanks. I wish I had some kind of, maybe we can throw in some like scary music here, talking about the Vatican archives and library. Maybe we can get into a little conspiracy theory here, but how did you go about your work on this? So what is the polyglot? And again, what is its importance now that you've been able to get access to some of this material?
Great question. So a polyglot is basically a book with the same text in multiple languages. And so the Polyglot Bible is an entire, complete Bible. It's 6 volumes, but the 6th volume is more just resources that would be helpful for somebody that was using the first 5 volumes, like a dictionary and a grammar and stuff like that. Volumes 1 through 4 have the Old Testament, and Volume 5 has the New Testament. Volume 5 is the one that I studied. Altogether, you have Hebrew, Aramaic, Latin, Greek, etc. On the same page. Volume 5 has a Greek column and a Latin column, so it's not interlinear. It's not Greek over Latin or Latin over Greek. They have their own separate column. So it really is remarkable. I had the opportunity to see a number of different copies of it. I don't think you know this, Mike, but I actually found the 5th volume, the Greek and Latin New Testament, at the Library of Congress. It had been misplaced. They had sent it out. So it's crazy, right? They had actually sent it out to be rebound over 80 years ago.
I think somebody at the Smithsonian took it away.
Yeah, I don't know. But they sent it out, and when they sent it out, the people that rebound it, when they embossed it on the spine, they put the wrong information on the spine. And so anyways, I when I went to the Library of Congress, I was talking to the guys there. I said, you have to have Volume 5. There's no way the Library of Congress doesn't have Volume 5. And we ended up locating it. And you can imagine the librarians at the Library of Congress running around. I mean, I joke with them now that I'm like Indiana Jones, but they say it really wasn't that big of a find, but anyways, ended up going to the Vatican, and that was a remarkable experience. It's really incredible, the protocol that you have to go through to get in. There's not very many people per year that get access to go into the rare manuscripts room. So I didn't just get into the library, I got into the rare manuscripts room, and they were extremely gracious, extremely nice to me and hospitable. Most of the looking at the manuscripts, though, I was able to do through what's called the INTF, which is the Institute for New Testament Textual Research that's in Munster, Germany. But I did do research at the Vatican and looked at their manuscripts while I was there, the ones that I couldn't access via the database from Munster. But I'll tell you that you said you wanted a conspiracy story. I'll tell you this one real fast. The curator, while I was at the Vatican Library, the curator in the rare manuscripts room, while I was sitting at my computer looking at manuscripts, he would email me occasionally. And one of the questions he had for me, and this is pretty remarkable considering that this person is responsible for one of the most important New Testament manuscripts, Codex Vaticanus. But he emailed me and he asked me while I'm in the room, why are you wasting your life looking at this? Now, it's pretty remarkable, but it kind of sets it in perspective that not everybody looks at the Bible the way that we do, and because the Word of God is inspired, and not just the words that are in the Bible, but as Dave Black, who I studied under at Southeastern, as he would say, God didn't just inspire the words; He inspired the tense, the voice, the mood, the person, the number, the gender, the case, the word order, the phrase order, the clause order, the discourse structure, and I'm glad I actually even get to say that, because I think more people need to have a more robust understanding of biblical inspiration. It's not just words. He chose tenses, voice, moods, persons, number, gender, case, word order, clause order, phrase order, discourse structure. All of that was inspired by God. And but not everybody looks at the Bible the same way. And I will say this, and just to reiterate, the Vatican was extremely hospitable, and it was true. It truly was one of the best experiences of my life looking at manuscripts there. They would not let me see Codex Vaticanus, though.
You can get that in facsimile, can't you? But you didn't get to touch the original. Well, I don't know. You might leave a smudge on it or something. Maybe leftover like chocolate. You just have a chocolate bar. Oops, there it goes on the page.
When I went to Peru, there's copies of this first Greek New Testament and really the whole polyglot Bible. There are copies really. There's not that many, but there are copies literally all over the world. When I was in Peru, for example, my wife found a news article. My wife's Honduran, so we travel down to Central and South America regularly to teach and train believers around all throughout Latin America. And we also translated David Allen Black's Learn to Read New Testament Greek into Spanish. You ought to check that out because we really talk about a revolution. We really caused a revolution with how we published that book. Maybe that'll be another podcast sometime. But when we were down there, my wife found, in Peru, my wife found out, they have a copy of the Complutense in Polyglot here, Thomas. You want to go see it? I said, absolutely, let's go. Nobody knows. No, when we went and asked about it, nobody knew where the Complutense in Polyglot Bible was. What it had actually been it had actually been plundered during a war with Chile and Peru, and so they stole it when Chile had invaded Peru. They stole a bunch of books, rare manuscripts, out of the Peruvian library, and it had just been returned in 2008 to the Peruvian government. And so when we were asking about it, nobody knew where it was, but they told me, they said all of those books that were brought back from Chile are still in a warehouse. I'll just tell you this, if you've ever been to Central or South America, it is not a good thing that something as valuable as this would be found in a warehouse. So anyways, they ended up, I told them how important it was, and they responded, and they went and tracked this thing down. It took them 2 days to find it and dig it out. And they brought it to me, and I'll never forget when they brought it to me. I got to view it up in the National Library, and they want it's just an absolute. Who would have guessed that this would just be tucked away in a library, in a bodega, in a warehouse? But it's amazing the things that we've uncovered just from looking for this thing and studying it over the past 3 years.
It reminds me of the scene in Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade when they're talking about Marcus, how he got lost in his own museum. Stuff like that really does happen. Things get misplaced, and then, who's going to find it? The last person that handled it could slip it in a drawer somewhere, and it's gone. That kind of stuff really happens. So, well, thanks for letting us get a little glimpse of that. And yes, folks, there really are people out there who do textual criticism. There are a few of those. They tend to all be here this week, or at least most of them, at some point in the week. So just so that you know that there's still a lot of work to do there. People find things all the time, either intentionally or unintentionally, and in this case, again, moving back before Erasmus, in that whole history of that text family, what we now know, or what we now call, Byzantine majority. Here you go. You have somebody who, all of a sudden just decided, was moved and prompted to spend some time looking at the thing that came before, and that became a dissertation, and that'll have its contribution. It'll leak into text critical discussion and evaluation of variants, probably get a new look because of Thomas's work. So those people are out there. Pun intended, I guess. Right? All right, well, thanks a lot. Well, we're back. We have another guest with us. I'm going to introduce Randall Price, who will be familiar to a lot of you. Randall has a pretty large presence online, has a ministry devoted to archaeology and biblical studies, but beyond that, I'll let him introduce himself, give out your website, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. The website is worldofthebible.com. And so World of the Bible is a ministry that deals with the past, the present, and the prophetic world of the Bible. Past deals with archaeology of the Bible to help us understand that ancient text. For many times, if you don't have a proper context, it's hard to understand the text itself. And today, because of the way many churches approach the handling of the scriptures, it's very topical. It's, grab bag, pick and choose, and you don't have the opportunity to go to the context to understand what's there. And of course, that's very important to understanding the message itself. But we're removed by thousands of years as well as thousands of miles from that original context. So one of the things our ministry does through archaeology and other things is to bring the world of the Bible to the word of the church. That second area, which dealt with the present, we have the Middle East today is a conflicted stage. And I've written books, done videos and things related to the Middle East conflict. I had the opportunity for not only to live in Israel, I went to school there, but I've got to know a lot of the people, actually on both sides of the conflict through the years, prime ministers, other people. And from that, been able to address some of the issues because I'm aware of them. The third area was the prophetic, because out of all of this grows the promise of Jesus Christ that he's going to return. And in his coming, there are promises that he said he would fulfill, then he will. Mm-hmm. The Jewish people largely do not believe Jesus is the Messiah because they say there are things the Messiah was supposed to do that Jesus did not do. And that's true. He didn't regather Israel to the land. He didn't rebuild the temple. He didn't bring peace on earth. Simple things like this. No, he hasn't yet, but he's going to, because his first coming was to deal with suffering and provide redemption. And he promised, I will come again. So it's very important to understand the context for the fulfillment of prophecy is the original stage where that prophecies were given. That is the Middle East.
Do you ever run into a situation where you almost have to convince people that they should care about the original context? Because to us, that's just axiomatic. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I've had discussions, I've gone to places to speak, and you can just tell. I mean, and some people will actually verbalize it. Well, why should I care about what happened in some ancient culture? Even if it's contemporary, who cares?
Well, we're even past a postmodern way of thinking, but that is that you are the standard of things. It really doesn't matter, the reader interpretation. It doesn't matter what the Bible says, what I think the Bible says, or what I feel the Bible says. And why should I worry about the ancient context where it was given? I live in the 21st century, which matters. My argument is, for instance, if we don't get it right in the original context to the original people to whom the message was given, we're not going to be able to export it to the 21st century in an accurate way and apply it to ourselves. Mm-hmm. For instance, I'll give you an example, Psalms 46, 10. I've heard many people that just read this passage. It says, be still and know that I am God. Well, what does that mean to most people? Well, it means be still, sit under a tree, contemplate creation.
Oprah talked about that on her show.
But now the original context, if you read the verses before and even after, deal with the nations who are warring against God. And what it literally says is, cease striving against me, acknowledge my sovereignty. Well, that's a very good message, too, but it's the message that was intended for that passage. I mean, we can all be still and know that God, and there's a place for that, but that's not what the text says. And it shouldn't matter to us that God wrote it, and he wanted to communicate a certain message. Mm-hmm. So we need to understand that message and live that out. So many people get, truths that are not in the text. And that should matter because they're not sourced in what God gave.
Right. It's not why God prompted that particular thing to be written. Yeah.
Right.
Now, you do a lot of work with Dead Sea Scrolls and archaeologically in that,
yes.
In the Qumran context. What can you give us an update there?
Yeah.
What are you up to?
Well, for 10 years, I was director of excavations at Qumran, which is the site where the Dead Sea Scrolls were produced and hidden away. And for those who don't know what the Dead Sea Scrolls are, those are the oldest copies of the Bible that we have. They've been preserved. They go back 200 years before the time of Jesus, largely. There was a Jewish community that produced these. And while the New Testament gives us accounts of the Pharisees and Sadducees, they left no writings of their own. And we really don't have any window into the time of Jesus to gauge the accuracy of the history of that site. Apart from the New Testament. And there's some other types of, manuscripts out there. But when the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, we had not only these oldest copies of the Bible, but they left us a vast literature commenting on the people, the political situations, many other things. And all of a sudden, you could see when Jesus came into the world, the Bible says in Galatians 4:4, it was at the right time. Mm-hmm. And we said, why didn't he come today? I mean, we have satellites that communicate his message all over the world. No, it was the right time. There was a road system that the Romans had. There was a united language of Greek that could be communicated. But his people were spiritually bankrupt. He came at the time of the greatest need, and the prophets have predicted that time. And those who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls were aware of that. They were looking for the coming of the Messiah. They were and I believe there was a large number of them that came to the Lord probably after Pentecost or at Pentecost. We know that in Jerusalem, priests, it says in Acts 6, many of them were becoming obedient to the faith, which indicates to me that if priests there could, then the priests who lived at Qumran might as well, because they had more of an affinity and a closer relationship to the prophets, which gave the message of the Messiah. Now, one of the things I'm going to be doing just a few weeks from now, I'm taking a team. We're going back to the Qumran area. There are Dead Sea Scroll caves, because originally these scrolls that were written were put in jars, then hidden away in caves to preserve them for their own library use. But then when they were attacked by the Romans in the year AD 68, they fled from the site. A lot of them went to Masada, and then they all perished there in the year 73. So these things just stayed in the caves, and nobody knew they were even there until somewhere in the 1940s. Some Bedouins, kind of local shepherds in the area, stumbled upon some, and we know about some. We know of some 12 caves.
So you're going to participate. I read something recently about kind of systematically going through the area, checking more caves or pre-checking.
That's being done now. There was originally back in 1984 something called Operation Scroll. And when the area, particularly Jericho and others, were being turned over to the Palestinian Authority, the archaeologists were afraid that Qumran, because they said they're going to be a religious site, on the map of the Palestinians. And everybody believed it was Qumran. So the archaeologists said, we need to go through these caves, just kind of do a survey, see what's there, because if they're going to be turned over, we'll lose this opportunity. One of the caves that was surveyed is the one I'm going to be working in. But there's a new impetus because they have discovered, with just the whole political situation, Palestinians, Bedouins, others looting caves. And some of this stuff goes to the ISIS, and it's across the board right now to fund military operations or other things. So they're in the caves, digging illegally, taking the stuff out, selling it to the highest bidder, private collections, and this information will be lost forever. And again, context is important. You find an artifact, but it's not where it came from. You don't know where it came from. Artifact in itself tells you something, but it tells you much more if it's there, in the original place where it last existed.
Are you operating under the auspices of a larger group? I know you got to get permission from the Antiquities
Yeah, you have to have
Authority.
a permit. We spent about since I surveyed this cave about 6 years ago, we've taken the time. I had to get the publication of my previous excavations further along so I would be allowed to do another one. And with the permission now to do this, we're kind of coming in before this initiative to search widespread the caves. We're going to do this one cave. And it's I'm working with Israelis and working with others, and I have a team from the States that comes over. But it's ambitious work. I mean, you've got a cave way up high in the cliffs. You've got to climb to it. It's pretty rugged, and there's not a lot of room in there. We've got to get rocks out because the ceiling has collapsed in many cases over the years. But the potential of finding more scrolls, when you imagine that from a monetary sense, just one piece of a scroll the size of a thumbnail is $1 million. And that's how precious these things are. But the knowledge that they bring them is far more precious. And we know there's more out there, but they just haven't been discovered. So appreciate people's prayers on this, because it's a work. We only have 2 weeks to do the work. It has to be done very effectively.
Yeah. So you're pretty prolific. Last question. Do you have a recent book that you would tell the audience about, something you'd recommend?
Yeah. One of the areas that I write quite a bit in is concerning the temple in Jerusalem. It's because of the conflict there. People need to have accurate information. So I did a book called Rowe's Guide to the Temple. It's a full-color book. You can find it in most any bookstore. And the publisher's name is Rose. That's why it's Rowe's Guide to the Temple. But I wrote the book. So a fully illustrated, nice book. We also produced a computer program called the Virtual Tour of the Temple. And that allows people, if anybody listening has ever gone to Israel, and they go to Jerusalem, they want to visit the Temple Mount. But it's under the control of the Muslim authorities, and they will not allow you to talk about the temple, which they say never existed. You can't bring a picture. You can't open your mouth about it. So you lose this whole historical context where Jesus, spent the last week of his life for sure teaching and visited 3 times a year, when he was growing up, and where so much of history took place. So we went up there with, shall we say, hidden cameras, hidden microphones. It took us 3 years because it took time to get this done. And we used a 360-degree camera, too. So now this is produced in such a way when you get this program, you put it on your computer and you're there. You can turn any way you want to. You can see behind you and forward. You can jump walls, you can go over things, go all over the Temple Mount. And there's data points that are pulled up in charts and maps, but also about 100 videos in which I'm teaching on the Temple Mount, the very thing you can't do today. Right. I did, and you get a chance to do that. So that's available from our World of the Bible Ministries at worldofthebible.com.
All right, worldofthebible.com. Well, hey, thanks for spending a few minutes with us. And
Certainly.
Lord bless your ministry and your success and your safety over there when you get going. So thank you.
You're most welcome.
All right, Mike, those are 2 great interviews. 3, actually. That's pretty neat, going to the secret vaults of the Vatican and then digging for more Dead Sea Scrolls. I mean, that's pretty awesome right there.
Yeah, well, that's the kind of thing you'll run into here. It's one of the reasons to come.
I know, it's crazy. I feel like I need to feel like I'm an assistant to Indiana Jones or something. I don't know what, but it's crazy. It's amazing to see just the different levels of interest, and I mean, it's literally the spectrum. I mean, it's, for me, this is my first time here. It's amazing seeing just a different level of expertise and interest. I mean, there's so many niches in biblical studies that it just goes on and on and on.
Yeah, it's important for our listeners and really everybody to realize that this is an event. I mean, a lot of people are familiar with conferences, and it's sort of the, again, what I affectionately call Christian Middle Earth conferences, prophecy conferences, and conspiracy conferences, and sort of lay-level Bible conferences. Those are the things that most people are going to be familiar with. And an event like this is totally off the radar. But this is the time of year when you'll get, in the evangelical world, 2,000 or 3,000 people at this event. And then in the wider biblical studies world of religion, later in this week, the Society of Biblical Literature Conference will be starting, and archaeology conferences. You'll get 10,000, 12,000 scholars of all, faith commitments or no faith commitments, but anybody who's anybody at the scholarly level in biblical studies and theology and archaeology. They are here this week. And so people, again, need to get exposed to this.
It's almost overdose.
It is. Yeah, that's a word you could really use. Over 1,000 papers during the week that you could go to. So overdose is not a bad way to categorize it.
All right. Well, I'm looking forward to our interviews that we have coming up, and stay tuned. We have a lot more to come. This is only part 1, so be looking forward to part 2. And I just want to thank everybody for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. God bless.
Thanks for listening to the Naked Bible Podcast. To support this podcast, visit www.nakedbibleblog.com. To learn more about Dr. Heiser's other websites and blogs, go to www.drmsh.com.